The dust swirled around Natalie Kensington's boots as she watched three men struggle to hold a wild-eyed bay stallion against the corral fence, their curses carrying across the ranch yard like desperate prayers that would never be answered. She had arrived in San Francisco, California just 2 days ago, seeking work as a seamstress or cook, anything to earn her keep after her father's death left her without family or fortune. But the moment she saw that magnificent creature fighting for his freedom with every fiber of his being, something deep in her chest pulled tight and refused to let go. The horse screamed, a sound of pure rage and terror combined, and one of the men lost his grip on the lead rope. The stallion reared high, front hooves slicing through the autumn air of 1876, and the other two men scrambled back, leaving the animal to bolt across the enclosure, his dark coat gleaming with sweat in the afternoon sun. "That is the third time this week," a voice said from behind Natalie, and she turned to see a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds, watching the scene with a mixture of frustration and something that looked like sorrow. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that spoke of determination and stubbornness in equal measure. "My father bought him from a trader 6 months back, thinking he could be broken like any other horse. But Storm, that is what we call him. He has got a spirit that cannot be crushed." "Why would you want to crush it?" Natalie asked, the words escaping before she could think better of speaking so boldly to a stranger, especially one who clearly had authority on this ranch based on the quality of his boots and the way others glanced his direction. The man's eyes shifted to her, surprise flickering across his features as he seemed to truly see her for the first time. "Theodore Crawford," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "This is my family's ranch, the Double C, about 5 miles outside the city proper, and you are the young woman who came looking for work. I heard tell of it from our housekeeper this morning." "Natalie Kensington," she replied, meeting his gaze directly, even though propriety suggested she should lower her eyes. At 22, she had learned that survival sometimes meant breaking the rules that society tried to force upon women, especially women without male relatives to speak for them. "I can sew, cook, clean, tend gardens, and I have a fair hand with accounts if you need help with ledgers." "But not horses?" Theodore asked, and there was something in his tone that was not quite mockery but close to it. "I grew up on a small farm in Oregon," Natalie said quietly, watching as Storm paced the far side of the corral, his head high and his ears pinned back. "We had 3 horses, all of them gentle as lambs, but I remember one mare that my father brought home from auction. She had been beaten, starved, treated worse than any creature should ever be treated. Everyone said she would never be good for anything, that he should just put her down and be done with it." Theodore waited, and Natalie could feel his attention focused completely on her words now. "But my mother, she had a different way of thinking about animals. She said that trust broken by cruelty could only be healed by patience and kindness, not by more force. She spent hours every day just sitting in that mare's stall, not touching her, not demanding anything, just being present and peaceful. After 2 weeks, the mare started eating from her hand. After a month, she would let my mother brush her. After 3 months, she was the best horse we ever owned, loyal and gentle and hardworking beyond measure." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Theodore said, and the past tense in his words told Natalie he had already guessed that she too was gone. "She died when I was 17, Natalie confirmed. "Fever took her in the span of 3 days. My father followed her 4 months ago. His heart just gave out one night while he was sleeping. I sold the farm to pay his debts, and I came here hoping to start fresh in a growing city where opportunities might exist for someone like me." Storm screamed again, and both of them turned back to watch as the stallion charged the fence, stopping just short of crashing into it, his whole body trembling with the effort of holding himself back. "He is going to hurt himself if this continues," Natalie said softly, "or hurt someone else, and then you will have to destroy him, and that would be such a terrible waste of something beautiful." Theodore was quiet for a long moment, and Natalie could see him thinking, weighing options and possibilities. My father is in Sacramento for the next 2 months, visiting my sister and her new baby. He is the one who insists we keep trying to break Storm the old way, with force and dominance, and wearing him down until his spirit cracks. But I have never liked that method, even though it is what I was taught growing up. Then try something different, Natalie said, and she was not sure where her boldness was coming from, except that she could not stand to see such a magnificent animal reduced to a trembling, broken shadow of himself. You think you could do what your mother did? Theodore asked, and now he was looking at her with genuine curiosity, his eyes searching her face as though trying to see past the surface to whatever lay beneath. I do not know, Natalie admitted honestly, but I would like to try if you would let me. And if it works, perhaps you would consider keeping me on in some capacity. I need the work, and you clearly need someone who sees horses as more than just tools to be used and discarded. Theodore rubbed his jaw, and Natalie could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. She knew she was asking for something unusual, knew that most ranch owners would laugh at the idea of a woman with no formal training attempting what their experienced cowboys could not do. But there was something in Theodore Crawford's expression that gave her hope, some hint of openness to new ideas that spoke well of his character. 2 weeks, he said finally. I will give you 2 weeks to show some kind of progress with Storm. In the meantime, you can help our housekeeper with the cooking and cleaning to earn your room and board. But every spare moment, you work with that horse. If at the end of 2 weeks he is no better, or if anyone gets seriously hurt, we sell him to the rendering plant and be done with it. Agreed? It was not a generous offer, Natalie knew. 2 weeks was hardly any time at all to undo months of mishandling and fear. But it was more than she had any right to expect, and she found herself nodding before she could talk herself out of it. Agreed, she said. And when Theodore extended his hand to shake on it, she took it without hesitation, feeling the rough calluses of a working man against her palm and noticing the way his grip was firm but not crushing, respectful of her despite her gender. Then welcome to the Double C, Miss Kensington, Theodore said, and for just a moment, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. Though I should warn you, you may have just agreed to the most difficult challenge of your life. That is fine, Natalie replied, releasing his hand and turning back to look at Storm, who stood watching them now, with his ears pricked forward, as though he sensed that something had just shifted in his world. I have never been afraid of difficult things, Mr. Crawford, only of giving up before I have truly tried. The housekeeper, a broad-shouldered woman named Margaret with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner, showed Natalie to a small room on the second floor of the ranch house. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corrals and the rolling hills beyond. Natalie set down her single carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the weight of what she had just committed herself to before she squared her shoulders and went back downstairs. She spent the rest of that afternoon helping Margaret prepare dinner for the ranch hands, learning the rhythms of the kitchen and the expectations for meals. There were 8 cowboys working the Double C full-time, plus Theodore and his younger brother James, who was 19 and still learning the business. Margaret explained that Theodore's father, Marcus Crawford, had built this ranch from nothing 30 years ago, buying land when it was cheap and building his herd through careful breeding and smart purchases. Mr. Theodore, he has got his father's head for business, but his mother's heart, Margaret confided as they rolled out dough for biscuits. She passed when he was just 15, and I think some part of him stayed soft because of her, even though his father tried to toughen him up. That is why he gave you this chance with Storm. Mark my words. His father would have shot that horse weeks ago. That evening, after the dishes were washed and put away, Natalie made her way back to the corral where Storm was kept. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of flames, and the air had cooled enough to be comfortable after the warmth of the day. The stallion stood in the far corner, his head up and alert, watching her approach with eyes that showed white around the edges. Natalie did not go into the corral. Instead, she pulled up an overturned bucket and sat down just outside the fence, close enough that Storm could see her clearly, but far enough that he would not feel trapped or threatened. She did not try to call to him or make any sudden movements. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, and let the silence settle around them both like a blanket. Storm paced for a while, his hooves stirring up small clouds of dust with each step. He would approach to within 20 feet of where she sat, then veer away, tossing his head and snorting his displeasure at her presence. But Natalie did not move, did not react to his displays. She had learned from watching her mother that the first and most important step in gaining an animal's trust was to prove you were not a threat, and the only way to do that was through absolute patience and calm. The stars were beginning to appear overhead when Theodore's voice drifted across the yard. "You plan to sit there all night?" Natalie turned to see him approaching, his work for the day apparently finished based on the way his shirt was damp with sweat and dust clung to his trousers. "Just until full dark," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so as not to startle Storm. "I want him to get used to me being near without anything being demanded of him." Theodore leaned against the fence post a few feet away, and Natalie was conscious of his presence in a way that had nothing to do with Storm and everything to do with the way the fading light caught the planes of his face and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him even when he was standing still. "You really think this will work?" he asked after a moment. "I think it has a chance," Natalie replied honestly. "But I cannot promise anything, Mr. Crawford. Every horse is different, and Storm has been through things I can only guess at, based on how he reacts to people. All I can do is offer him something different than what he has known and hope that eventually he chooses to accept it." "Theodore," he said suddenly, "if you are going to be working here, even for just 2 weeks, you might as well call me Theodore. Mr. Crawford makes me feel like my father, and I am not sure I appreciate the comparison these days." "Then you should call me Natalie," she replied, glancing at him with a small smile. "Miss Kensington makes me feel like a school teacher, which I am decidedly not." "Natalie," Theodore repeated as though testing how her name sounded on his tongue, and there was something about the way he said it, with a slight softness to the vowels, that made her heart skip in a way she firmly told herself was completely inappropriate, given that she had known this man for less than a day. They sat in companionable silence as the darkness deepened, and Natalie noticed that Storm had stopped pacing and was now standing still, watching them both with an expression that seemed less fearful and more curious. It was a small change, barely noticeable, but to Natalie it felt like a victory worth celebrating. "I should get back to the house," Theodore said finally, pushing away from the fence post with obvious reluctance. "Early start tomorrow. We are moving cattle to the north pasture. But Natalie, I want you to know that I meant what I said about giving you a fair chance. Whatever my father might think when he returns, I believe there are better ways to work with animals than the old methods, and I am willing to see if you can prove it." "Thank you," Natalie said simply, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "That means more than you know." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, and Natalie sat for another hour in the growing cold before finally making her way back to the ranch house and her narrow bed, her mind already planning the next day's approach with Storm. The pattern repeated itself over the next 3 days. Natalie rose before dawn to help Margaret with breakfast, spent the morning assisting with laundry and cleaning and food preparation, and then every afternoon and evening, she returned to the corral to sit with Storm. She never entered his space, never tried to touch him or approach him beyond sitting on her bucket just outside the fence. Sometimes she talked to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him stories about her childhood on the farm, about her parents, about the journey to California, and her hopes for the future. Sometimes she simply sat in silence, letting the horse grow accustomed to her presence without any pressure or expectation. Theodore checked on her progress each evening, and they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation that surprised Natalie with its comfort. He told her about the challenges of running a ranch in a region that was changing rapidly, how San Francisco itself was transforming from a rough gold rush town into a real city with culture and sophistication, even as the surrounding areas held on to their frontier character. He spoke about his father's expectations, about the pressure to marry well and produce heirs to carry on the Crawford name, about his own dreams of expanding the ranch and trying new breeding techniques he had read about in agricultural journals. In turn, Natalie found herself sharing things she had not spoken of in months, about the loneliness after her father died, about the fear of being alone in the world with no family to fall back on, about her determination to make her own way rather than accept charity or compromise her independence by marrying someone she did not love just for security. That is rare, Theodore said on the fourth evening, his voice thoughtful. Most women in your situation would be desperate to find a husband, any husband, rather than risk ending up in a factory or worse. Then I suppose I am not like most women, Natalie replied, keeping her eyes on Storm, who had gradually begun spending more time closer to where she sat, though he still maintained a careful distance. My mother always told me that a marriage without love and respect was a prison, and she would rather I lived free and poor than wealthy and trapped. I have tried to honor that wisdom, even when it would be easier not to. Your mother must have been quite a woman, Theodore said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice that made Natalie's chest tighten with old grief and new appreciation. She was, Natalie agreed softly, and I miss her every single day. On the fifth day, something shifted. Natalie was sitting in her usual spot, humming an old song her mother used to sing while working in the garden, when Storm took 3 deliberate steps toward her and stopped perhaps 10 feet from the fence. His ears were forward, his posture alert, but not aggressive, and when Natalie carefully extended her hand, palm up through the fence rails, the stallion stretched his neck out and blew softly through his nostrils, scenting her without quite making contact. Easy, beautiful boy, Natalie whispered, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Storm could hear it. No one is going to hurt you, I promise. You are safe here. The horse held her gaze for a long moment, and Natalie could have sworn she saw intelligence in those dark eyes, a weighing and measuring of her intentions and character. Then Storm tossed his head once and turned away, trotting to the far side of the corral, but it did not feel like rejection. It felt like a beginning. Theodore was working with a young colt in the adjacent paddock when it happened, and when Natalie glanced his way, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was wonder there, and respect, and something else she could not quite name, but that made her skin feel warm despite the cool breeze. You have a gift for this, Theodore said, abandoning the colt to walk over to where she sat. I have been around horses my entire life, worked with the best trainers money could buy, and I have never seen anything quite like what you just did. That horse has not willingly approached anyone since we got him. It is not a gift, Natalie said, trying to ignore the way her pulse raced at his nearness and the genuine admiration in his voice. It is just patience and respect. I am not trying to dominate Storm or bend him to my will. I am just offering him a choice and letting him decide when and if he wants to accept it. Still, Theodore insisted, crouching down beside her so they were at eye level, and Natalie could see flecks of gold in his gray eyes that she had not noticed before. What you are doing is remarkable, Natalie, and I want you to know that regardless of whether Storm becomes fully tame, I would like you to stay on here at the Double C. We could use someone with your skills and your way of thinking about animals. That is very kind, Natalie said, and she was surprised to find that her voice was slightly unsteady. But your 2 weeks are not up yet. Let us see what happens before we make any decisions about the future. Theodore nodded slowly, but he did not move away, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with something Natalie had no name for, but that made her feel both terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Natalie, Theodore began, but whatever he was going to say was interrupted by the sound of hooves and shouting from the direction of the main barn. They both stood quickly, and Natalie's stomach dropped as she saw James Crawford riding hard toward them, his face flushed with urgency. "Theo!" James called, pulling his horse up in a spray of dirt. We have got a situation with the cattle in the south pasture. Looks like rustlers tried to make off with a dozen head last night. Some of the men are tracking them now, but they need you. Theodore's jaw tightened, and Natalie could see the immediate shift from the man who had been looking at her with such warmth to the rancher who had responsibilities and decisions to make. Get my horse saddled, he told James, and send word to Sheriff Morrison in town. I want this handled legally, not with guns and bloodshed if we can avoid it. James nodded and wheeled his horse around, galloping back toward the barn, and Theodore turned to Natalie with clear reluctance. I am sorry, I need to go deal with this. It might be late when I get back. Be careful, Natalie said, and she meant it with a fierceness that surprised her. In less than a week, Theodore Crawford had become important to her in ways that went beyond employer and employee, and the thought of him riding into potential danger made her chest ache with worry. Always am, Theodore said with a slight smile, and then he was striding away, his long legs covering ground quickly as he headed to join his men. Natalie watched him go, and then she turned back to Storm, who was watching the commotion with ears pricked forward and tension in every line of his body. I know, she said quietly. Change is frightening, is it not? When you start to trust and then everything becomes uncertain again. But we will be all right, you and I. We just have to keep choosing to trust even when it is hard. The stallion snorted softly, and Natalie chose to interpret it as agreement. Theodore did not return until well after midnight, and Natalie only knew because she was still awake, unable to sleep for worrying, despite Margaret's assurances that the Crawford men knew how to handle trouble. She heard the sound of multiple horses returning, heard the low murmur of male voices, and only then did she allow herself to relax enough to finally drift off, her last thought being that he was safe. The next morning, Theodore looked exhausted but unharmed when he came in for breakfast, and Natalie felt relief wash through her so strongly that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. We recovered the cattle, Theodore told the assembled household as Margaret served biscuits and gravy and eggs. The rustlers were just a couple of desperate men who had lost their land and were trying to feed their families. Sheriff Morrison gave them a choice between jail time or working off their debt on various ranches in the area. They chose the work. You let them go? James asked, disbelief clear in his young voice. After they stole from us? I let them make restitution, Theodore corrected firmly. Vengeance accomplishes nothing, James, but giving men a chance to redeem themselves and support their families honestly, that benefits everyone. Natalie met Theodore's eyes across the table, and she saw in them the same philosophy she tried to apply with Storm, the same belief that broken things could be healed through patience and second chances rather than punishment and force. It made her respect him even more, made her realize that this man was something rare and precious in a world that often valued hardness over compassion. After breakfast, she returned to her work with Storm, and this time, when she settled onto her bucket, the stallion walked directly over to the fence and stood facing her, just barely out of reach. Natalie remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, and after what felt like an eternity, Storm lowered his head and blew softly against her extended palm. The touch was so light it was almost imaginary, the faintest brush of warm breath and soft whiskers against her skin, but to Natalie it felt like a miracle. She kept her hand steady, kept her voice low and soothing as she whispered praise to the horse, and when Storm did not pull away immediately, she carefully, slowly, moved her hand to rest against the side of his muzzle. The stallion tensed, and Natalie froze, giving him time to process this new sensation, this vulnerable moment of connection, and then gradually she felt Storm relax, felt him lean ever so slightly into her touch, and her eyes burned with sudden tears that she refused to let fall. There you are, she whispered. There is that brave, beautiful boy. I knew you were in there, just waiting for someone to see you. She spent the next hour simply standing there, her hand resting gently on Storm's face, occasionally moving to stroke his neck or scratch behind his ears. The horse stood still for most of it, occasionally shifting his weight or turning his head to investigate her with his muzzle, but never pulling away, never showing any of the fear or aggression that had characterized his behavior before. By the time Natalie finally stepped back, her arm was aching and her back was stiff from holding the same position for so long, but her heart was so full she thought it might burst. She had done it. She had reached Storm in the way that mattered, had proven that patience and kindness could overcome even the deepest wounds. Theodore found her an hour later in the kitchen, helping Margaret prepare the midday meal, and the expression on his face told her he had already heard the news from one of the ranch hands who had witnessed her breakthrough. "Natalie," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Margaret glance between them with knowing eyes before quietly excusing herself. "I just saw Storm. He walked right up to me at the fence, calm as could be. I touched his face, and he did not even flinch. He is ready to start trusting again," Natalie said, unable to keep the pride and joy from her voice. "It will still take time, and we need to move slowly, but Theodore, I truly believe he can be everything you hoped for when your father bought him. He just needed someone to give him a reason to try." Theodore crossed the room in 3 long strides, and before Natalie could process what was happening, he had pulled her into an embrace that lifted her feet clear off the floor. She gasped in surprise, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, and then she was laughing, caught up in his enthusiasm and the pure happiness radiating from him. "You did it," Theodore said, setting her down but not releasing her, his hands resting on her waist, and his face split in a grin that transformed him from handsome to absolutely devastating. "In less than a week, you did what none of us could manage in 6 months. Natalie, you are extraordinary." They stood there, frozen in that moment of joy and connection, and Natalie became slowly aware of how close they were, how she could see the individual lashes framing Theodore's eyes and the slight stubble on his jaw that said he had been too busy to shave that morning. Her breath caught, and she saw Theodore's expression shift from elation to something more intense, something heated and focused entirely on her. "Natalie," he said again. But this time her name was a question, a request for permission, and Natalie found herself nodding even before her mind had fully caught up with what was happening. Theodore's kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though he was afraid she might startle like one of his horses. But Natalie had never been one to do things halfway, and when she rose up on her toes and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the emotion that had been building inside her over the past week, Theodore made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, one hand coming up to cup the back of her head while the other pressed her closer against him. It was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and passionate and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Natalie felt like the world had shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. "I have been wanting to do that since the moment you told me about your mother and the mare," Theodore confessed, his forehead resting against hers and his voice rough with feeling. "But I did not want to presume, did not want to make you uncomfortable when you were working here and dependent on my goodwill." "I have been wanting you to do it for almost as long," Natalie admitted, her cheeks flushing with the boldness of the confession. "But Theodore, we need to be sensible about this. I am still just a woman you hired a week ago, and you are the ranch owner. People will talk." "Let them talk," Theodore said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes with an intensity that made her shiver. "Natalie, I know this is fast, and I know we have only just met, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are smart and kind and brave, and the way you see the world, the way you believe in second chances and the power of gentleness. It matches something in me that I thought I would have to hide forever to live up to my father's expectations." "What are you saying?" Natalie asked, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I am saying that I want to court you properly," Theodore said, taking her hands in his and holding them like they were something precious. "I want to take you to dinner in the city, introduce you to my friends, show you off to everyone who matters. I want to spend my evenings talking with you, learning everything there is to know about you, and I want to fall asleep thinking about your smile and wake up planning ways to make you happy." "Theodore," Natalie breathed, overwhelmed by the rush of emotion his words created inside her. Yes, yes to all of that. His smile could have lit the whole state of California, and when he kissed her again, it was with a joy and certainty that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Over the next week, Natalie continued working with Storm, and the stallion's progress was nothing short of remarkable. She started entering the corral with him, moving slowly and deliberately, always giving him space to retreat if he needed it. But Storm seemed to crave the contact now, following her around the enclosure like an oversized puppy, butting his head against her shoulder when he wanted attention. Theodore watched these sessions whenever his work permitted, and Natalie could feel his gaze on her like a physical touch, warm and approving, and increasingly affectionate. Their courtship was conducted largely in stolen moments between their daily responsibilities, but it was no less intense for being fragmented. Theodore brought her wildflowers he picked on the range, and Natalie made him a new shirt when she noticed his favorite was wearing thin at the elbows. They took long walks in the evenings after dinner, talking about everything and nothing, and sometimes Theodore would pull her into his arms and kiss her until she was dizzy with want and the need to be even closer to him. "You should start riding Storm," Theodore suggested one evening as they stood by the corral, watching the stallion graze peacefully in the fading light. "If he is as calm with you on his back as he is with you on the ground, that would prove once and for all that he is not beyond saving." Natalie felt a flutter of nervousness at the suggestion, but she trusted Storm now, trusted the bond they had built over the past 2 weeks. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "I will try tomorrow, if you will be there to help." "I would not miss it for anything," Theodore promised, and the pride in his eyes made Natalie feel capable of anything. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for attempting something as significant as riding Storm for the first time since his arrival at the Double C. Natalie was so nervous she could barely eat breakfast, and Margaret noticed, pressing an extra biscuit into her hand and telling her that fortune favored the brave. Theodore met her at the corral with a saddle and bridle, and together they approached Storm, who watched their preparations with interest but no fear. Natalie took her time introducing the stallion to each piece of equipment, letting him sniff the leather and the metal, showing him that nothing was going to hurt him. Storm accepted the bit with only minor resistance, and when Theodore carefully settled the saddle on his back, the horse shifted but did not bolt or rear. "That is incredible," Theodore murmured, his hand still resting on the saddle as though ready to pull it off if Storm panicked. "He is allowing this like he has been doing it his whole life." "He probably has," Natalie said quietly, checking the girth strap and adjusting the stirrups to her height. Whatever happened to break his trust, it was not the equipment that hurt him. It was the people using it. She took a deep breath, placed her foot in the stirrup, and swung up into the saddle in one smooth motion. Storm tensed beneath her, his muscles coiling tight, and Natalie immediately relaxed her body, keeping her hands light on the reins and her legs loose against his sides. "Easy, sweet boy," she whispered, leaning forward to stroke his neck. "See, nothing bad is happening. You are safe, and I am not going to hurt you." Storm stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, and Natalie could feel Theodore's tension from where he stood just outside the corral, ready to intervene if needed. But then the stallion blew out a long breath, his muscles relaxed, and he took one tentative step forward. Natalie kept her aids minimal, letting Storm choose his own pace and direction, and the horse walked calmly around the corral, his ears forward and his gait smooth. After a few circuits at a walk, Natalie asked for a trot with the gentlest pressure of her legs, and Storm responded immediately, his trot floating and comfortable, the kind of movement that spoke to excellent breeding and natural athleticism. "Natalie, that is amazing!" Theodore called out, his voice filled with wonder. "You have done it. You have actually tamed him." But Natalie shook her head even as she smiled, bringing Storm back to a walk, and then halting him near where Theodore stood. "I did not tame him," she corrected gently. "Taming suggests breaking, forcing something wild to become docile. What Storm and I did was build trust. He chose to accept me, chose to let me lead, and that makes all the difference. Theodore reached through the fence to stroke Storm's nose, and the stallion leaned into his touch with a contentment that would have been unimaginable 2 weeks ago. You are right, Theodore said, looking up at Natalie with eyes that held more than just admiration, that held something deeper and more permanent. And that is exactly why I am falling in love with you, Natalie Kensington. Because you see the world in a way that makes it better. And you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. Natalie's breath caught, and she carefully dismounted, her legs slightly unsteady from the emotion flooding through her as much as from the ride. Theodore, she said, and her voice was thick with feeling. I love you too. I have loved you since you gave me a chance with Storm, since you showed me that you value kindness and second chances over tradition and cruelty. You are a good man, and I would be honored to build a life with you, if that is what you want. Theodore did not answer with words. Instead, he vaulted over the fence with athletic grace, crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, and swept her into a kiss that was both passionate and tender, full of promise and hope and the beginning of something that would last the rest of their lives. Storm snorted softly beside them, and when they broke apart, laughing and slightly breathless, the stallion had his head lowered and his eyes half closed, the very picture of contentment and peace. I should ask you properly, Theodore said, pulling back just enough to look into Natalie's eyes while keeping his arms wrapped around her waist. Natalie Kensington, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, and by all rights we should wait longer, get to know each other better, but I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else, and I do not want to waste a single day pretending otherwise. Yes, Natalie said simply, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. Yes, Theodore Crawford, I will marry you. The ranch erupted into celebration when Theodore announced their engagement that evening at dinner. Margaret cried and hugged Natalie so tightly she could barely breathe, telling her that she had known from the first day that there was something special between the two of them. James looked surprised but pleased, shaking his brother's hand and telling Natalie that she was getting the best man he knew. Even the ranch hands seemed genuinely happy, offering congratulations and teasing Theodore about being caught by a woman who preferred horses to people. The only shadow on their happiness was the knowledge that Marcus Crawford would be returning from Sacramento in a few weeks, and there was no telling how he would react to his eldest son marrying a woman with no dowry, no family connections, and no social standing beyond what she had built through her own efforts. He will have to accept it, Theodore said firmly when Natalie voiced her concerns late that night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one overhead. I am 27 years old enough to make my own decisions about who I marry and how I run this ranch. And Father will come around once he sees how happy you make me, once he sees what you did with Storm and understands the value of your approach to training. Natalie wanted to believe him, but she had been raised by parents who understood that social class and economic status mattered in ways that love alone could not overcome. Still, she was determined to prove herself worthy of Theodore's faith in her, to show Marcus Crawford that she was more than just a charity case or a temporary infatuation. Over the next month, Natalie threw herself into life on the Double C with fierce determination. She continued working with Storm, gradually introducing him to more advanced training and discovering that the stallion was not only gentle and willing, but also remarkably intelligent. She started helping Theodore with the other horses on the ranch, applying her methods to young colts that were just beginning their training and to older horses that had developed behavioral problems. In every case, her patience and respect-based approach yielded results that impressed even the most skeptical of the ranch hands, but she also made sure to prove herself in more traditional ways, working alongside Margaret to manage the household, learning to cook the hearty meals that working men needed, and even helping with the accounting when Theodore mentioned being behind on his ledgers. She wanted Marcus Crawford to see that she was not just marrying his son for security, that she brought real value to the ranch and to the family. Theodore watched her efforts with a mixture of pride and concern, And one evening he pulled her aside and said gently, Natalie, you do not have to prove yourself to anyone, least of all my father. I love you exactly as you are, and that is all that matters. I know, Natalie assured him, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the slight rasp of stubble under her palm. But I also need to prove to myself that I can do this, that I can build a life here that is more than just being your wife. I want to be a true partner, Theodore, someone who contributes equally to our future. You already are, Theodore said, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. But I understand the need to prove yourself, especially when you have had to fight for everything you have. Just do not forget that you are allowed to rest sometimes, allowed to simply be happy without constantly working to earn your place. His words touched something deep inside Natalie, some wounded part of herself that had been alone and afraid for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be unconditionally accepted. She leaned into Theodore's embrace, letting herself draw strength from his steady presence, and whispered, I am happy, happier than I have ever been, and that terrifies me because I keep waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing is going to go wrong, Theodore promised, though they both knew it was a promise he could not really make. We are going to get married, we are going to build this ranch together, and we are going to be happy for the rest of our lives. I stake everything I am on that certainty. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in San Francisco, with Margaret and James as witnesses and a handful of Theodore's friends in attendance. Natalie wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric that Theodore bought for her in the city, pale blue muslin that brought out the color of her eyes and made her feel beautiful in a way she had not experienced since she was a girl. Theodore looked devastatingly handsome in his best suit, his hair combed back and his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle toward him. When the minister asked if he took Natalie to be his lawfully wedded wife, Theodore's I do rang out clear and strong, full of conviction and joy. And when it was Natalie's turn, she looked into the eyes of the man she loved and said, I do, with equal certainty, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The kiss that sealed their marriage was sweet and full of promise, and as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Natalie felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from pure, overwhelming happiness that something so good could have come from something as simple as sitting outside a corral and offering patience to a broken horse. They spent their wedding night at a hotel in San Francisco, and Natalie discovered that the passion she had felt in Theodore's kisses was only a hint of what being truly intimate with him would mean. He was gentle and attentive, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable, and when they finally came together as man and wife, it felt like the most natural and right thing in the world, a physical expression of the emotional bond that already existed between them. Afterward, lying in Theodore's arms with her head resting on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, Natalie said quietly, Thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. My life was so empty before I came to the Double C, and now it is fuller than I ever dared to dream. I should be thanking you, Theodore replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You came into my life and showed me that the things I believed about kindness and second chances were not weaknesses, but strengths. You made me believe that I could run this ranch differently than my father, that I could build something better. And you loved me even though I am just a simple rancher with more dreams than money. You are so much more than that, Natalie said fiercely, propping herself up on one elbow so she could look at him properly. You are brilliant and compassionate and strong in all the ways that matter, and our children are going to be so lucky to have you as their father. Something shifted in Theodore's expression at the mention of children, a deepening of emotion that made his eyes bright. You think about that? He asked. Having children with me? Of course I do, Natalie said softly. I want to build a family with you, Theodore. I want to have babies that have your eyes and your stubbornness, and maybe a bit of my way with animals. I want to watch them grow up on this ranch, learning to respect the land and the creatures that share it with us. I want all of it. Theodore kissed her then, deep and thorough, and there were no more words needed as they lost themselves in each other once more, celebrating their new life together in the most fundamental way possible. They returned to the Double C the next morning, and life settled into a new rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Natalie moved her few possessions into Theodore's room, which was now their room, and she fell asleep each night wrapped in his arms, feeling safe and cherished in ways she had never experienced before. Storm continued to thrive under her care, and by the time Marcus Crawford was due to return from Sacramento, the stallion was being ridden daily by both Natalie and Theodore, proving himself to be everything they had hoped for in terms of temperament and ability. Several neighboring ranchers had already inquired about buying him, but Theodore refused all offers, saying that Storm was staying with the Double C as a testament to what could be accomplished with patience and the right approach. The day Marcus Crawford arrived home, Natalie was working with a young mare in the training paddock, completely absorbed in her work and unaware that the patriarch of the Crawford family was standing at the fence watching her with his son by his side. Marcus Crawford was an imposing man in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair and eyes that held a sharpness that spoke of decades spent evaluating livestock and making hard decisions. When Natalie finally noticed him and realized who he must be, her stomach dropped and her hands grew clammy with nervousness. "Father," Theodore said, and there was a careful neutrality in his tone that suggested this conversation was not going to be easy. "This is my wife, Natalie. Natalie, this is my father, Marcus Crawford." The word wife hung in the air between them, and Natalie watched Marcus's expression shift from confusion to shock to something that looked like anger before settling into a careful blankness that was somehow more frightening than open rage. "Your wife," Marcus repeated slowly, his gaze moving from Theodore to Natalie and back again. "Would someone care to explain to me when my eldest son got married and why I was not informed, let alone invited?" "We were married 3 weeks ago," Theodore said evenly, moving to stand beside Natalie and taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity and support. "We wanted to wait until you returned to tell you in person, but the marriage itself could not wait. I love Natalie, Father, and she loves me. This is not a rash decision or a foolish mistake. This is the best choice I have ever made." Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he simply stared at his son as though trying to recognize him. Then he turned his attention to Natalie, looking her up and down with an assessment that made her feel like a heifer being evaluated at market. "And what exactly do you bring to this marriage, miss? Or I suppose I should say Mrs. Crawford?" Marcus asked, his tone cold. "What family connections? What dowry? What skills or accomplishments that make you worthy of my son?" Natalie felt Theodore tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand and stepped forward, meeting Marcus's gaze directly. "I bring nothing in the way of money or connections," she said clearly, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "My parents were simple farmers, and they left me nothing but their values and their teachings when they died. But I do have skills, Mr. Crawford. I can cook and sew and keep accounts. I can work harder than most men half my age when circumstances require it. And I have a gift for working with horses, for seeing past their fear and anger to the potential underneath and helping them become everything they are capable of being." "A gift for horses," Marcus repeated, and there was clear skepticism in his voice. "Is that what my son told you to convince you that you have value?" "No," Theodore said sharply, his patience clearly fraying. "That is what I observed with my own eyes when Natalie accomplished in 2 weeks what our entire crew could not do in 6 months. Father, do you remember Storm? The bay stallion you bought from that trader, the one you told me to destroy if we could not break him?" Marcus's expression flickered with recognition. "Of course I remember. Meanest horse I've ever encountered, with a streak of violence that made him dangerous. Please do not tell me he is still on this property." "He is," Theodore said, and now there was pride in his voice. "And he is one of the best horses we own, thanks to Natalie. She gentled him using methods based on patience and trust instead of force and domination. And now he rides as calm as a plow horse, but with the spirit and intelligence intact. She has done the same with three other problem horses since then, and I have ranchers from as far as Sacramento asking if she can work with their difficult animals. Marcus's attention sharpened at that, and Natalie could see the businessman in him calculating the potential value of what Theodore was describing. Show me, he said abruptly. Show me this miracle horse. They walked to the main corral where Storm was kept, and Natalie felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Everything depended on this moment, on whether Marcus Crawford could see past his expectations and prejudices to recognize the truth of what she and Theodore had built together. Storm was grazing peacefully when they approached, but he lifted his head immediately at the sound of Natalie's voice calling his name. The stallion trotted over to the fence, his ears forward and his expression eager, and when Natalie reached through to stroke his face, he leaned into her touch with obvious affection. Marcus stared, and for the first time, Natalie saw genuine surprise on his weathered face. That cannot be the same horse. It is, Theodore assured him. Same horse, just treated with respect instead of brutality. Natalie opened the corral gate and walked inside, and Storm followed her like a puppy, butting his head against her shoulder and wuffling softly. She ran her hands over his neck and shoulders, checking him over with practiced ease, and then she looked back at Marcus and said, "Would you like me to show you what he can do?" Marcus nodded slowly, and Natalie spent the next 20 minutes putting Storm through his paces, demonstrating his smooth gaits, his responsiveness to her aids, and his absolute lack of the fear and aggression that had characterized his behavior when she first arrived. By the time she brought him back to a halt and dismounted, Marcus was shaking his head in evident disbelief. "I would not have thought it possible," he said, and there was a grudging respect in his voice now. "That horse was a lost cause, and yet you made him into something valuable. How did you learn to do that?" "My mother taught me," Natalie said simply. She believed that broken trust could be healed through patience, and she proved it with every animal she ever worked with. I just followed her example. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Natalie could see him thinking, weighing options and implications. Finally, he turned to Theodore and said, "I still do not approve of you marrying without consulting me first. You are my heir, and your choice of wife affects the entire family's standing and future." "I know," Theodore said, and his voice was firm. "And I am sorry if you feel disrespected by my decision. But, Father, I am also a grown man, and I have the right to choose my own wife based on love and compatibility rather than social advantage. Natalie makes me happy in ways I never thought possible, and she brings real value to this ranch through her skills and her approach to training. I hope you can accept that and welcome her into our family." Marcus looked at his son, then at Natalie, and finally back at Theodore with an expression that suggested he was seeing his eldest child in a new light. "You have changed," he said finally. "Grown stronger in your convictions. I suppose that is at least partly her influence." "Entirely her influence," Theodore corrected, and the love in his voice made Natalie's eyes burn with unshed tears. "Natalie showed me that there is more than one way to be strong, and that standing up for what I believe in matters more than blindly following tradition." Marcus sighed heavily, and some of the tension seemed to drain out of his shoulders. "Very well. I cannot change what has already happened, and I suppose I should be grateful that my son chose a woman with practical skills, rather than some empty-headed society girl who would be useless on a ranch. Welcome to the family, Natalie. I hope you understand what you have gotten yourself into." It was not the warmest welcome Natalie could have hoped for, but it was better than outright rejection, and she felt a surge of relief so strong it made her knees weak. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," she said sincerely. "I promise I will do everything in my power to be an asset to this family and to this ranch." "See that you do," Marcus said gruffly, and then he walked away, leaving Theodore and Natalie standing by the corral, with Storm watching them with curious eyes. Theodore pulled Natalie into his arms the moment his father was out of sight, and she could feel him trembling slightly, with residual tension and relief. "You were magnificent," he whispered against her hair. "The way you stood up to him, the way you proved your worth without backing down or apologizing for who you are. I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." "I was terrified," Natalie admitted, her face pressed against Theodore's chest and her hands fisted in his shirt. "I thought he was going to demand you annul the marriage or disown you." "He would have lost me forever if he had tried," Theodore said fiercely. "I meant what I said, Natalie. You are my wife, my partner, and my future. No one, not even my father, gets to take that away from us." Life on the Double C settled into a comfortable pattern over the following months. Marcus Crawford proved to be a fair man once his initial anger faded, and he even grudgingly admitted that Natalie's approach to horse training was yielding impressive results, both in terms of the quality of their animals and the growing reputation of the ranch for humane and effective training methods. Natalie continued to work with the horses daily, and Theodore supported her efforts by hiring an additional hand specifically to help with the training program. Word spread throughout the region about the woman who could gentle even the most difficult horses, and ranchers began sending their problem animals to the Double C for Natalie to work her magic on. It brought in additional income that helped offset the costs of running the ranch, and it also gave Natalie a sense of purpose and accomplishment that went beyond being Theodore's wife. But her favorite moments were still the quiet evenings spent with her husband, walking the property as the sun set and talking about their dreams for the future. Theodore wanted to expand the ranch, buy more land, and breed better horses. Natalie wanted to start a proper training school where young people could learn humane methods of working with animals. Together, they plotted and planned, their visions merging into something larger and more ambitious than either could have accomplished alone. 6 months after their marriage, Natalie realized she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first: a missed monthly cycle, a slight queasiness in the mornings, a tenderness in her breasts that made wearing her usual work clothes uncomfortable. But as the weeks passed, the symptoms became unmistakable, and Natalie found herself both thrilled and terrified by the knowledge that she was carrying Theodore's child. She told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, and the expression on his face when he understood what she was saying made every moment of fear and uncertainty worthwhile. "A baby," Theodore breathed, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Natalie, we are going to have a baby." "We are," she confirmed, covering his hand with her own and feeling the warmth of his palm through her dress. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Theodore said, and there were tears in his eyes as he pulled her close, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that suggested she was made of spun glass. "You have given me everything, Natalie. A love I never thought I would find, a partnership that makes me better than I could be alone, and now a child to carry on everything we are building together. I am the luckiest man alive." "We are both lucky," Natalie whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Natalie had to gradually reduce her work with the more difficult horses as her belly grew and her balance shifted. She focused instead on training the younger horses and on teaching the methods she had developed to the new hand Theodore had hired, a young man named Sam who had a natural gentleness with animals that reminded Natalie of her own mother. Theodore became almost comically protective as Natalie's due date approached, hovering anxiously whenever she went near the horses and trying to convince her to stay in the house and rest. Natalie tolerated his concern with good humor, understanding that it came from love rather than a desire to control her, but she also refused to be treated like an invalid, continuing to work and contribute to the ranch right up until the day her labor began. The birth itself was long and difficult, lasting through an entire night and into the following afternoon. Margaret stayed with Natalie throughout, offering support and encouragement, while Theodore paced the hallway outside, too anxious to sit still but too afraid to leave in case something went wrong. But when their son finally entered the world, red-faced and screaming his displeasure at being forced from the warm comfort of the womb. Every moment of pain and fear was forgotten in the rush of pure, overwhelming love that flooded through Natalie. "A boy," Margaret announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket and placing him carefully in Natalie's arms. "And from the sound of those lungs, a healthy one." Theodore burst into the room moments later, his face pale and his eyes wild with worry. And Natalie smiled at him through her exhaustion, holding out their son for him to see. "Theodore, meet your son," she said softly. "Our son." Theodore approached slowly, reverently, as though afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment. When he looked down at the tiny wrinkled face of his newborn son, his expression transformed into something so tender and awestruck that Natalie felt tears streaming down her face. "He is perfect," Theodore whispered, reaching out to touch one miniature hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around his father's much larger digit in an instinctive grip. "Natalie, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel Marcus Crawford, honoring Theodore's father, while giving their son his own identity, separate from family expectations. Marcus was surprisingly moved when he learned the baby's middle name, and his relationship with Natalie thawed considerably after that, as though the arrival of his first grandchild had finally convinced him that her place in the family was secure and permanent. The first year of Daniel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments of watching their son grow and change. He had Theodore's gray eyes and Natalie's stubborn chin, and by the time he was 6 months old, he was already showing signs of his parents' combined determination and willfulness. Natalie managed to balance her work with the horses and her responsibilities as a mother, though there were days when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But Theodore was a devoted father, sharing the nighttime feedings and diaper changes, playing with Daniel for hours when he came in from working the ranch, and making sure Natalie had time to herself to pursue her training work. When Daniel was a year old, Theodore approached Natalie with a proposal that had clearly been occupying his thoughts for some time. "I have been thinking," he said one evening, as they watched their son toddle unsteadily across the parlor floor, his chubby legs still uncertain, but his determination absolute. "About your dream of starting a proper training school. I think we should do it, Natalie. We have the land, we have the reputation, and you have the skills and the philosophy to teach others. It would be a legacy for Daniel, something he could be proud of and maybe even take over someday if he shows an interest in the work." Natalie looked at her husband, at the man who had believed in her from the moment she first spoke to him about Storm, and felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. "Are you sure? It would be a significant investment, and there is no guarantee it would be profitable, at least not right away." "I am sure," Theodore said firmly. "You changed my life when you came to this ranch, Natalie. You showed me that there are better ways of doing things, that progress and tradition do not have to be in conflict. Let me help you change the lives of others who want to learn what you have to teach." So they began planning in earnest, converting one of the older barns into a teaching facility, building additional corrals and paddocks for the horses that would be used in the training program, and putting out word that the Double C Ranch would be accepting students for intensive courses in humane horse training beginning in the spring. The response was overwhelming. By the time the first session began in April of 1878, they had 20 students enrolled, ranging from young men hoping to become professional trainers to older ranchers who wanted to improve their own methods. Natalie taught the classes herself, demonstrating techniques with Storm and the other horses she had trained, and Theodore assisted with the practical sessions, helping students work through the challenges of applying theory to reality. The school was a resounding success. Students left with new skills and a different perspective on animal training, and many of them went on to establish their own reputations for humane and effective methods. The Double C Ranch became known throughout California and even beyond as a center of progressive thinking about animal welfare, and Natalie found herself corresponding with horse trainers as far away as New York and Boston, sharing ideas and learning from others who shared her philosophy. But despite all the success and recognition, Natalie's greatest joy remained her family. She and Theodore had two more children over the years, a daughter they named Grace, who was born when Daniel was 3, and another son, William, who arrived 2 years after that. The ranch house rang with the sound of children's laughter, and Natalie could hardly remember the lonely, frightened woman she had been when she first arrived in San Francisco, looking for any work she could find. Daniel grew up with horses the way other children grew up with toys, and by the time he was 7, he was already showing a natural talent for working with the animals that suggested he had inherited both his parents' gifts. Grace was more interested in the business side of the ranch, following Theodore around with a ledger and asking endless questions about accounting and management. William, the youngest, seemed content to simply exist in the moment, playing in the dirt and chasing chickens with the boundless energy of a happy child. Storm lived to the remarkable age of 23, spending his later years as a beloved member of the ranch rather than a working horse. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep one spring morning, Natalie grieved as though she had lost a family member, and Theodore held her while she cried, understanding that Storm represented so much more than just a horse. He was the beginning of everything they had built together, the catalyst that had brought them into each other's lives and proved that broken things could be healed with patience and love. They buried Storm on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Theodore planted an oak tree at the site as a living memorial to the horse that had changed both their lives. Over the years, as that oak grew tall and strong, it became a favorite spot for the Crawford family to gather, a place to remember where they had started and how far they had come. Marcus Crawford lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren grow into young adults, and before he died at the age of 72, he told Natalie that she had been the best thing that ever happened to his son and to the ranch. Coming from a man as proud and stubborn as Marcus, it was the highest praise imaginable, and Natalie treasured those words for the rest of her life. Theodore and Natalie ran the Double C Ranch together for over 40 years, expanding it into one of the most respected operations in California. The training school grew and evolved, eventually expanding beyond horses to include other aspects of animal husbandry and care, and graduates of their program could be found on ranches throughout the western United States. But through all the years and all the changes, the core philosophy remained the same, that the best results came not from domination and force, but from patience, respect, and the willingness to meet animals where they were and help them become their best selves. Daniel eventually took over management of the ranch when Theodore's health began to decline in his late 60s, and he ran it with the same combination of his father's business acumen and his mother's compassion for animals. Grace married a lawyer from San Francisco and used her inheritance to start a charity focused on improving conditions for working animals in the city. William became a veterinarian, studying at a university back east before returning to California to open a practice that served ranches throughout the region. Natalie lived to be 78 years old, still active and engaged with the training school until just a few months before her death. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, lying beside Theodore in the bed they had shared for over 50 years, and her last conscious thoughts were of gratitude for a life that had been so much fuller and more beautiful than she ever could have imagined on that dusty afternoon when she first saw a wild-eyed stallion fighting for his freedom. Theodore followed her just 6 months later, his heart apparently unable to continue without the woman who had been his partner, his love, and his anchor for more than half a century. They were buried side by side on the hill near Storm's oak tree, and their headstones bore simple inscriptions that captured the essence of their lives. She tamed what others had given up on for Natalie, and he had the wisdom to recognize a gift for Theodore. The Double C Ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management and eventually passed to his own children, carrying forward the legacy that Natalie and Theodore had built together. The training school they established continued to operate for over 100 years, becoming a historic landmark and a testament to the enduring power of their philosophy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting and the breeze carried the scent of grass and horses, people swore they could see 2 figures standing on the hill by the oak tree, a man and a woman watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created, their hands clasped together and their hearts forever intertwined in a love that had begun with a simple act of faith in a broken stallion and a determined woman who refused to give up. The story of Natalie Kensington and Theodore Crawford became the stuff of family legend, passed down through generations of Crawford descendants. It was told as an example of how courage and compassion could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. How one woman's refusal to accept conventional wisdom about horses had led to a revolution in training methods that improved the lives of countless animals. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been: a love story. The story of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who recognized in each other the qualities they most valued, and who chose to build a life together based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and an unwavering commitment to making their corner of the world a little bit better than they found it. Their great great grandchildren still work the Double C Ranch more than a century after its founding, and they still use the methods that Natalie had pioneered all those years ago. And every new foal born on the ranch, every difficult horse that came in for training, was treated with the same patience and respect that Natalie had shown to Storm, proving that some legacies transcend time and that love, in all its forms, has the power to change the world one gentle touch at a time.